What's up, guitarists? Will Metz here, or Guillaume Metz, if you can say my name in French. Welcome back to this video. In this video, I'd like to talk a little bit about using scales versus using arpeggios as a framework to organize your fretboard and to improvise. So again, you're improvising over a chord progression that's in a specific tonality, major, minor, or a specific mode. And you're wondering, is it better to use scales, to think of a scale, or to think of arpeggios on every single chord and to try to target those chord tones that a lot of people talk about? Now, spoiler alert, before some of you start getting angry here, like, whoa, it's both. Of course, both are important. That's true. Both are important. But everyone has to start somewhere. And so a lot of guitarists, when they're on their journey, are confused at the beginning because they want to kind of find the best path, right? What should I practice first? I'm here trying to improvise. Some people say it's all about scales, right? Just learn your pentatonics or your major and minor scale. That's all you need to learn. Some other people will say, no, you got it all wrong. Actually, you got to learn arpeggios. It's all about the chord tones. Forget about scales. It's all about the chord tones. And of course, again, guitarists are confused. They're there, well, I don't know. Everybody seems to have their opinion, and I don't really know what I should practice first. And that's what I want to do in this video, is give you my 2 cents on how I believe you should organize your process over here in learning scales first or arpeggios first, etc. And what I think is the most efficient roadmap based on where you are on your journey, okay? And again, that's not going to be universal truth, but in my experience teaching a lot of students and in my own journey, I'll tell you what I think is the most efficient if you don't really know where to go. So what I'll do is I'll basically take a simple chord progression and we'll explore kind of the pros and cons of each framework, right? The framework of thinking of scales, exclusively scales over the whole improvisation, versus the framework of thinking exclusively of arpeggios. We'll see how that really does impact the way that one improvises, right? The way you think about your fretboard will typically influence the lines and the melodies that you create. And so I'll try to demonstrate that, and we'll talk about the pros and cons of each of those frameworks. If you're new here, again, my name is Will Metz, or Guillaume Metz, my French name. And I'm a former engineer of training, got my master's in engineering, and then I decided, you know what, I don't want to do that. I actually want to be a musician and a music educator. My engineer brain, however, led me into really being fascinated about music theory, especially as a mostly self-taught guitarist. I wanted to use this part of my mind to dissect music theory in a very logical way, and of course, how to understand and navigate the fretboard. This led to me developing a specific method, and this is the method that I use now to help other guitarists and empower them to become better, more educated guitarists and help improvise better and compose better. If you like what you hear in this video, then of course you know what to do. You can subscribe. That's the best way and free way to help me out. Give me a like, leave a comment. And if at some point you're interested in learning more about my method, I have founded a guitar academy where I personally help guitarists achieve these goals. And there is a link to a free training that you can watch down here in the description of this video, and a link to apply if you're interested in joining. Finally, before we get into it, understand I make long format content. I don't do little gimmicky 5-second things. I like to explain everything fully in detail. Now, some people love that. They're like, thank God for someone that's actually trying to give me detail. And some people get impatient and they're like, ooh, you're wasting my time. Just get to it, okay? Just don't even leave a comment. Just leave the video, right? Keep the vibes up. Let's keep the vibes up, guys, right? I'm here taking time, sharing my knowledge. You don't have to listen to what I'm saying over here, but I know that this information has helped a lot of guitarists, so I just keep doing it because I know some people enjoy it and they value this content. Okay, so in this video, we're going to use a simple kind of A minor blues chord progression to illustrate the things that I'm going to talk about here. So good old-fashioned minor 12-bar blues, we've got 4 bars of an A minor 7, then a couple bars of D minor or minor 7, back to A minor 7, then 1 bar of E minor 7, D minor 7, and back to A minor 7. Okay, there's other variations of this, but this is kind of the simplest, easiest minor 12-bar blues progression that I'm going to use to illustrate this. And I use this because I know a lot of you know, at least, if you're going to know one scale, you'll probably know the A minor pentatonic scale. So you already have some idea of how to improvise over this progression. Again, typically there are two main frameworks to improvise over this. When I say two main frameworks, it means two ways that you are going to organize your vision of the fretboard to basically, well, to know where to put your fingers, to know what you're going to play. Any musical context or chord progression will typically give you a certain palette of notes that are preferred to play, right? We'll say the right notes, quote unquote. Some people will say there is no right notes or wrong notes, but the preferred notes, the notes that you know if you play them, it's not going to sound bad, right? They're predictably going to sound good. So there is a palette of notes that you can play in a given musical context. If the key changes or if something happened in the progression, that palette of notes that is allowed might change throughout the tune. Now, luckily in this progression, it's pretty much the same, right? So the notes that are quote unquote allowed throughout the progression are relatively the same. There are some exceptions, we'll talk about it, but to make it simple, there is no big changes in context in this progression. But there is different frameworks that you can use to play these notes, right? To weave your melodies through these right notes. And the two main frameworks that we tend to use as musicians is scales. So we organize our fretboard using either the minor scale, in this case A minor scale, or A minor pentatonic scale, or in a case where there would be some modes you could play, we'll use modes as well. But we're basically covering a fretboard with dots, right, of notes that we know are playable over this chord progression that correspond to notes of a specific scale. The other framework that a lot of people use is the arpeggio framework. So in this case, we're basically following the chord progression and trying to play an arpeggio of every chord as we move along the chord progression. And again, an arpeggio of a chord is basically a way of melodically playing the notes of a chord. So for example, if I'm looking at an A minor 7 chord, that's the chord here with all the notes played at the same time. An arpeggio of that chord would be playing these chord tones, which are 1, flat 3, 5, flat 7, and then playing them melodically, so one after the other. Right? That was an A minor 7 arpeggio. And you would change the arpeggio you play as you're moving along the chord progression. So when you go to the D minor 7 chord, you would no longer play A minor 7 as an arpeggio. You start playing D minor 7. And then when you go back to A, you go back. Right? So this is the framework of arpeggios. And you can see that it's a different way of visualizing or seeing the fretboard than just thinking of, for example, my A minor pentatonic scale or my natural minor scale. Right? In this case, I'm visualizing the fretboard completely differently. So those are my two main frameworks. And again, that's why we say frameworks, because it's a way of seeing the same thing. It's kind of like using different maps to look at the same territory of notes. Try to make the difference here between what you play and what you think about when you're about to improvise or when you're improvising. But the important thing to remember is that what you think about will definitely have an impact on what you play. Again, another example would be that when I play an A minor pentatonic scale, those notes, right, A, C, D, E, G, A, these notes are part of the full minor scale. Remember, the pentatonic scale is a full minor scale minus the second, in this case B, and the flat 6, F in this case. So people might think, well, why would you think of the pentatonic scale rather than the full minor scale, since that pentatonic scale is included in the minor scale? It's because when I frame my fretboard with the pentatonic scale, I will play much different line, right? It's going to generate different ideas than if I'm thinking of the full minor scale. So again, I hope I'm being clear here with this notion of framework. And every musician uses frameworks, by the way, even the ones that play by ear, right? So for those of you that are like super stoked about people that don't know theory and that just play by ear, understand that even these people use frameworks, right? When they start playing, even though they're all trained by ear and they don't know any notes on their fretboard, right? The fantasy of every guitarist. They play so well and yet they don't have to do one bit of theory. That's what I want. Well, these people still, when they start playing, they have an idea on their fretboard of which notes are going to sound good or which notes they want to hear in their solos and which notes they're going to want to avoid. That work of basically differentiating the notes that you're going to want to gravitate around or play and the notes that you're going to want to avoid creates patterns on your fretboard. These are frameworks. And so even the people that play by ear have frameworks. And you can see how knowing theory and having a good understanding and knowledge of what's actually going on is much easier to figure out your frameworks than just doing everything by ear with trial and error. Again, your ear is a wonderful tool. It can help you decide which notes you want to play within these frameworks, but doing everything by ear and trial and error is much more difficult than actually having a good knowledge of theory and of your fretboard. Okay, so first let's start with the scale framework. So what are the pros and cons of the scale framework, and how does it end up sounding when you improvise with just that framework? So I'll try to improvise again in a way where I'm just thinking of scales and avoiding as much as possible thinking in terms of arpeggios to see what that sounds like. When you're using the framework of scales or modes, what you want to do is essentially find the scale or mode, if it's again a modal situation, from which that chord progression is originated. Every chord progression typically will come from a specific scale, right, or key, or a mode. So your job in that case is to make sense of the chord progression and looking at this group of chords, think, oh, these chords come from the scale of, in this case, for example, A minor. Once you find this, you now map your fretboard with the corresponding scale or mode, and on you go. You can start improvising. In this case, again, we know that the key is A minor. Right? So all the chords belong to the A minor scale. So you can just map out your fretboard with the A minor scale or A minor pentatonic, right? If the minor scale works, the pentatonic will work as well, or even the blues scale in this case, with the addition of the flat 5 in your patterns. And once you've mapped out, boom, you're ready to go, right? And of course, the more positions of that scale you know, the more you can actually move up and down the fretboard, the freer you will be to express yourself. So what are some of the pros of this approach? Well, the first one is that you basically only need one framework, right? You can get away improvising over this whole chord progression thinking of just one scale. And once you've mapped out that one scale with only one reference, right? A minor, or A minor pentatonic, that's it. You're ready to go. So this brings us to the second pro, basically, which is a consequence of this one, which is the scale framework is typically, in most situations, not in all, and we'll see why, it's a simpler framework. Sure, you have to learn your scales and learn them all over the fretboard, but at least you don't have to change the framework constantly, right? You think of A minor, you map it out, and that's it. The other pro of this approach to me is that the scale framework tends to sound a little more natural and a little more melodic, in my opinion. We'll contrast that again with arpeggios, but when you think exclusively of arpeggios, when you improvise, it can sometimes sound a little bit robotic or just unnatural. Melodically speaking or vocally speaking, again, scales are going to be a little more natural. People are much more comfortable receiving and singing scales than arpeggios. Again, this depends on the style, and that doesn't mean that arpeggios sound bad or necessarily unnatural. If you were going to stick to one context exclusively, I do think that scales sound a little more natural. It's also a little easier to use your ear in the framework of scales to go and make the lines that you're actually hearing in your mind. That's just my opinion again. Because the notes are a little closer together in scales, right? You don't have these bigger jumps of intervals like you'll have in arpeggios. it tends to be a little easier to navigate. Now, of course, there are some drawbacks as well to the use of scales as a framework exclusively. The first one, and that's probably something that everyone has experienced as a guitarist when you start improvising with scales, especially if you're using the full scale. So not the pentatonic, but the full minor scale in this case, for example, you'll realize that some of the notes, which are technically in the scale or allowed, don't sound necessarily as good. In fact, some of the notes, depending on which chord you're playing over, will straight up sound bad. An example of this is if you're playing over the one chord in this progression, A minor, playing the note F, which is again the minor sixth, landing on that note while you're on the A minor chord, it might startle you a little bit when you're improvising. If you're not careful, you'll be, and you'll realize, ooh, you'll kind of want to move back to another note because that note seems a little tense or a little dissonant. And there are other notes like that, again, depending on which chord you're playing over. So this is because, again, all notes in the scale, even though they're allowed, are not created equal. Some of them might be dissonant depending on the chord you're playing over. And that's a problem when you're using that framework of scales. So something you could do here, of course, is say, well, I can play my pentatonic scale the whole time, because typically the pentatonic scale avoids these problem notes that are in the full minor scale. But the problem is also that you lose the colors, the potential colors of these notes. Yes, for example, F doesn't sound great over the one chord here, but over that D minor chord, the 4 chord, the note F sounds beautiful because it's the third of that chord. So the same note, which is in the A minor scale, that's technically allowed over this whole chord progression, will sound meh over the one chord and will sound beautiful over the 4 chord, D minor. If you play the pentatonic scale and you avoid this note altogether, sure, it's safer, but you're also preventing yourself from having that beautiful color on the D minor chord. So that's, of course, the downside. How do you fix it? Well, one of the options is, as we'll see, is to incorporate some arpeggios. Using arpeggios will kind of counter this limitation over here. But honestly, sometimes rather than just thinking of a logical way of tackling this problem, just practicing your scale and using your ear and kind of noticing these things happen and letting your ear guide you within that A minor scale towards the notes that will sound best is, in my opinion, the best option, right? At some point, it's not just all about logic, about thinking about, should I think of this or think of that? Should I practice this or this? It's like just thinking of your A minor scale, the A natural minor scale, and practicing this over and over and over again over a track like this. At some point, you will develop the reflexes and the intuition and the ear to know which notes in that scale will sound best over which chord. Now, the second drawback of this framework is that it often makes people disconnected from the chord progression. And a lot of guitarists, when they start improvising, have no clue where they are in the chord progression when they're playing. And that's because they're not really thinking of the chords, they're thinking of that one pentatonic scale, for example, over the whole chord progression, and so they don't feel like they necessarily need to know where they are in the progression. And that's a problem because, again, even if you're just using scales as a framework, you should always know where you are in the progression. Not just because it will allow you to know which chord tones to favor, or when you could actually, for example, play a little bit of an arpeggio when you're trying to go to the other framework, but also because it's good to know when your solo is going to end, for example, when the form starts, or when you can maybe build a little bit of melodic tension versus when you should resolve your lines, right? So many guitarists will end their solo at some point, and it's like they don't realize that they're ending it in the middle of the form. It's like, no, sorry, there's like 4 more bars that you should be soloing. You can't just end your solo like this in the middle of the form. You need to know where you're at in the progression. So that's another drawback of thinking of scales. Finally, the third drawback of this framework of scales is that if there's anything happening in the chord progression that kicks you out of your original tonality or scale, you have to be able to catch what's happening and to know which modulation or which key you're going towards. And this requires a good understanding of harmony. So for example, if I take this chord progression that we were playing, and on the last chord, rather than playing an A minor, I play an E7, going back to A, right? So it'd go... Okay, well that E7 is technically not part of the A natural minor scale. It's what we call a borrowed chord, and it comes from either the harmonic minor scale or melodic minor scale, or there's other modes you can use over this chord. Bottom line, something's happening here. And if you don't understand harmony, you're going to miss this. Now, this is I would say, a fairly chill modulation. Over here you could still probably get away with it where you're just pentatonic scale or blues scale, but in some cases, if you're literally changing keys in the middle of the progression and you don't catch that, if you stick to your original scale, you're going to be off, and it could be by a lot, right? Imagine it's a half step modulation and you don't catch it. Well, you're going to be a half step off. It's going to sound horrible. So using scales as frameworks forces you to really kind of understand harmony and chord progressions, and to make sure, again, that you're using the right scale or mode as a framework. And when the chord progression is simple, or if it's just one key, it's great and it's simple, but when it starts moving around, it can be a little bit trickier. So let's play a little bit of a solo over here using just the scale framework over our progression. By the way, everyone, a little bit of promotion. If you're not interested, you can speed up to the next part. But I am still enrolling in my Metz Guitar Academy. What is my Guitar Academy? It's a place where I explain theory and fretboard navigation step by step, starting from the very basics all the way to the most advanced concepts, modes, tonality, borrowings, interchanges, all that stuff. We're going to explain everything you need to understand about theory and fretboard navigation to become a more advanced guitarist and break through the frustrating intermediate plateau that a lot of people get stuck in. It's a full 12-month training and education with me following you step by step and mentoring you to make sure you understand everything with guidance and accountability, and you'll also be part of a community of students that are like-minded and that are on the same journey. If you're interested, I have a free training that'll explain some of those concepts and my method in the description, and there is also a link to apply to my academy. Make sure you check it out, and I hope to see you there. Take care. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the arpeggio framework. So again, with the arpeggio framework, we're looking at this chord progression, and we are going to play on every single chord an arpeggio of that chord. Again, wherever that is on the fretboard. Remember that I can play an A minor arpeggio everywhere on my fretboard. I can play it here, I can play it here, here, right? All these are ways to play an A minor arpeggio, so you would also, just like scales, have to map your fretboard with the arpeggios all over the place. The difference again is that when I change to the D minor chord, for example, from my A minor, I'm going to want to change to D minor, and when it goes to E minor. So I'm following chord progression closely and changing the arpeggio that I'm playing based on the chord I'm playing over, right? Pretty straightforward. So pros and cons of this approach. Let's start with the pros. The first thing is that arpeggios are really safe. You're not going to play any wrong notes if you play arpeggios because you're literally playing the notes of every chord. So by definition, every note will sound in. It will sound consonant. So your risk here is zero. Contrast that again to scales where we saw that some notes sometimes might sound a little bit funny depending on the chord you're playing over. That won't happen with arpeggio. They also allow you, and this is probably the best thing, to really follow the chord progression way better and outline the chords, which is again a great thing because your solos will sound definitely more appropriate. You're doing something that a lot of teachers will say is very important, which is someone will listen to your solo and be able to hear the chord progression in your solo. And that can be, again, very melodically pleasing, but not always. It's not the end all be all, right? Again, we'll demonstrate this. Sometimes focusing on common tones between chords and thinking of a scale and building a nice natural melody will beat trying to play all the arpeggios of every single chord. That is not always true, but it's good. Again, it's a great exercise, and it will force you to have this closeness and relationship to the chord progression, which a lot of guitarists lack. Finally, the cool thing about arpeggios is that you can play arpeggios without having a single clue of what's happening in terms of the tonality or the modality. Essentially, as long as you follow the chords and you play the arpeggios of each chord, you don't even need to know what key you're in, right? It doesn't matter. You will sound appropriate and in no matter if there is a key change whatsoever. If you know your arpeggios well enough to do that, you could literally play over a whole chord progression, not ask yourself once what key you're in or if there is a modulation or whatever. In the example that I gave you where it goes to that E7 chord, even if you're like, oh, I don't really know what the key is or what scale I should be borrowing from or whatever, doesn't matter. Just play the arpeggio of that chord and you'll sound great. Now, what are some of the drawbacks? Well, one of the very obvious drawbacks of arpeggios is that it's really, really, really hard to master following chord progressions like this with arpeggios. It's hard enough to master arpeggios. They're technically difficult to play because you're skipping from one string to the next all the time. So there's a little bit of getting used to with the picking. And again, like you have to learn them typically all over the fretboard and it can take a lot of time. So it's technically challenging. And navigation wise, it's very challenging because you have to change your framework all the time. Remember, anytime a chord changes from one to the next, you have to remap the fretboard with the new arpeggio. And that can take a lot of practice, especially if there is a lot of fast changes in the progression. In this case, it's kind of chill. We have 4 chords. It stays on A minor for a long time. So it's okay. You could probably get this done, fairly soon. It'd be a good practice, actually. But when it starts going fast, like 2 chords per bar, you're playing some fast jazz or something, it can be very challenging to play arpeggios, not just technically again, but also navigation-wise. The other thing is you'll realize that at the beginning, it's very difficult to make arpeggio framework sound natural or melodic. At the beginning, it tends to sound very robotic. It'll sound a little bit too like classical or metal-y when you play those arpeggios, because again, they do have that sound like, right? It's easy to kind of start playing like this. The only way you're not going to play like this is if you start using different groupings or adding little notes or chromaticisms or things like that around those arpeggios. And again, that takes a lot of time to develop. Finally, this is kind of connected to the previous point, is that it's so difficult to navigate with arpeggios that for a long time, it's very difficult to express yourself and be really creative with them. You're so focused on just like rolling through the punches, trying to change from that chord to the other one, etc., that it's difficult within all this chaos to actually try to find something really melodic that you want to say. Again, this is a little easier to accomplish when you're thinking of scales. Finally, the other thing with arpeggios that can be a little limiting is that because you're just playing the notes of every chord, it will, if you're just using arpeggios again, typically prevent you from playing different colors than the chord tones of a specific chord. So in this progression, for example, if I'm literally playing the arpeggio of each chord, I'll play A minor 7 over A minor 7. But that will prevent me from playing, for example, the note B, which would be the 9 of that chord, which sounds beautiful. And again, once you start getting more advanced, you'll know that you can play the 9 over that chord even if you're thinking of an arpeggio. But at that point, you start kind of entering a world where, again, you're mixing arpeggios as a framework and the full scale, the minor scale, which is ultimately, of course, the goal. Okay, so now I'm going to demonstrate what it would sound like if I played over this chord progression with just an arpeggio, like a strict arpeggio framework. So see, interesting sound, but again, I think like it's a little bit robotic. It's hard for me, at least. Some people are better at that than me. It's hard for me to express myself fully when I'm only thinking of arpeggios. So what I tend to do, if you want my personal kind of frameworks, is I will always typically use a scale as a home base or a main framework. And then occasionally, within the lines that I'm creating, I will use little bits or little fragments of arpeggios. I will also sometimes use arpeggios over chords when I'm not really sure what scale I should be playing. And so if it's going really fast, I'll just go ahead with an arpeggio because I'm unsure. I was actually messing around with a tune the other day that was going from I think it was an A13 and then to an A flat major. And for some reason, I couldn't remember exactly what scale I was supposed to be playing there. So arpeggios saved me. Right? And then messing around with other notes that I could hear might fit, right? So that's where your ear can start kind of coming into play. Right? So that note, I was like, yeah, that sounds good. And their arpeggios definitely saved my butt, right? But typically I'll try to have at least a home scale pattern, and even when there is a modulation, I'll try to catch which scale or mode I should be switching to when something like that happens. But again, when you're in the ring, right, trying to improvise, you're just rolling with the punches, trying to use anything you can to create a good solo and have a good framework. And to me, it's good to have a safe zone. That safe zone will be my scale, and I'll use arpeggios to complement that playing. And some people might have a different approach. Maybe there's some people that have the other way around, where they're mostly thinking of arpeggios, and sometimes they'll add little fragments of scales. That is personally not me. And it's also not what I recommend my students when they're just starting their improvisation. So what about the action plan for you? What do I recommend for you depending on where you are on your journey? Step number one, if you're just getting started on your improvisation journey, is I really think you should focus on crushing the pentatonic scales. Major and minor pentatonic scales all over the fretboard with the addition of the blue note. And again, not just half-ass one position, like really crush those pentatonic scales. And I have a link to a video over here if you want to learn how to really master the pentatonic scales and how to practice them. That, to me, for a guitarist especially, is the best bang for your buck. You can become a very good and dangerous guitarist with just a great knowledge of the pentatonic scale. I was actually watching a video of one of my favorite guitarists, Jack Gardner, and of Matteo Sasato, and they were both saying like, hey, if here is one thing you should know before you start wondering, having existential crises about which modes or scales you should know, first, do yourself a favor, learn your pentatonic scales really well. All right? I'm not the only one saying that. Always remember that you should be able to play incredible solos with that tool. It is the easiest tool and most kind of naturally melodic tool there is. So if you can't make good solos with the pentatonic scales, the odds of you being able to make a good solo with other tools are very, very slim. So start there. Once you start getting comfortable with the pentatonic scales, you can kind of go a few different routes over here. You can start learning your full scale, so the full 7-note major and minor scale, or even explore some modes. But it can also be a good idea at this level to start incorporating some arpeggios. And when you're first starting with arpeggios, I recommend using like little 3-note triad arpeggios. Essentially, rather than learning the full kind of vertical arpeggios like and then, rather than learning these, try to focus on learning your triads all over the fretboard, right? So if it's A minor, learn your triads in all sets of 3 strings. I also made a video on that you can check out. And you can use these triads in the chord progression. So start looking at the chord progression when you're improvising. Start to create that connection with the chord progression. That's essential if you want to use arpeggios. And then in some moments of the progression, when you're otherwise playing your pentatonic solos, say you're getting to the D minor chord, there is a little D minor arpeggio. You can even move it to the next shape, and that sends you to a different place on the fretboard with your pentatonic, and then go back to the minor pentatonic scale. A minor comes around. Right? So I'm really just mostly using my pentatonic and blues scale, but trying to add little 3-note mini triad arpeggios there. That would be the first step into starting to use arpeggios. Once you start getting comfortable with this, of course you can start, if you want, learning the full arpeggios. Like again, over several octaves and all over the fretboard. Right? Learn these arpeggios, major, minor, augmented, diminished, and then even, if you want my opinion, I think the tetrad, so 7th chords arpeggios sound even more beautiful, like major 7 or minor 7. Right? So go on a journey of really dialing into arpeggios, and you can at that point try to temporarily, right? Remember, this whole time you've been mostly thinking of scales, you've been mostly just using little bits of arpeggios. It could be a good time at that point to take a few months in your training and say, you know what, for a few months, I'm going to try to think mostly of arpeggios. I'm going to switch to the other extreme of frameworks and focus on arpeggios, 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 arpeggios. All over the fretboard, every chord progression you play, you try to use arpeggios. And again, the point here is not to change the way you play and never play scales again, but forcing yourself to play like this at some point in subtle ways is going to start kind of dripping into your normal playing, is going to influence the way that you play normally. And then when you go back to kind of letting go of that rule, of that limitation, and you just play normally with whatever you want or hear, you'll notice that it will dramatically change the way that you play, even if you're thinking of mostly of your scale framework. And what you'll find mostly is not necessarily that you start using a bunch of arpeggios all the time, but because you will have done that work of focusing on arpeggios for a while, of really obsessing over them, you will be much better at following the chord progression, and even within your scale lines, at emphasizing the right chord tones, or at least of knowing where these chord tones are. And that is one of the very powerful things that arpeggios can teach you while you're studying them, even if that's not the main framework that you're using. All right, guitarists, that's it for this video. I hope this was helpful. Again, if you like this, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. If you want to learn with me or learn more about the Will Metz Guitar Academy, you can apply or watch the free training below. I really appreciate you. Thanks so much for your support. And let's just do a little normal, with no barriers or no extreme framework improvisation on that chord progression to finish this video.